The crystal chandelier in the Manhattan penthouse cast 1,000 scattered lights across the marble floor as Victor Harrington III dropped to his knees. His $4,000 Italian suit pressed against the cold stone. His hands that had signed billion-dollar deals, hands that had shaken with presidents and kings, now trembled uncontrollably. "Say it again," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, say it again." The 7-year-old boy standing before him, the boy who hadn't spoken a single word in 4 years, opened his mouth. And what came out would change everything. But to understand why a billionaire was sobbing on his knees, begging his own son to speak, you need to know about the woman everyone called just the maid. The woman they laughed at. The woman they dismissed. The woman they tried to destroy. The woman who saw what no one else could see. This is her story. This is his story. This is the story of how silence became the loudest truth of all. Victor Harrington III was not a man who accepted failure. At 42 years old, he had built Harrington Technologies into a $47 billion empire. His face graced the covers of Forbes, Bloomberg, and Time magazine. His name was synonymous with innovation, power, and relentless success. But every night, when the world saw him as invincible, Victor would stand outside his son's bedroom door, listening to the silence that broke him piece by piece. Ethan Harrington was 7 years old. He had his mother's honey brown eyes, his father's stubborn chin, and a mind that doctors said was exceptional. His IQ tests placed him in the gifted category. His understanding of complex concepts amazed every specialist who examined him. But Ethan hadn't spoken a word since he was 3 years old. Not since the accident. Not since the night that changed everything. Victor remembered that night with a clarity that haunted his dreams. The rain, the headlights, the sound of metal screaming against metal, and his wife, beautiful, brilliant Caroline, looking at him one last time before the world went dark. She didn't survive the crash, but Ethan did. And when the little boy woke up in the hospital 3 days later, surrounded by strangers in white coats, he opened his mouth to call for his mother. And nothing came out. Not a sound, not a whisper, not a single word. The doctors called it selective mutism, a severe anxiety disorder triggered by trauma. They said his vocal cords were fine. They said his brain was healthy. They said, with the right therapy, with the right approach, with time and patience, he might speak again. 4 years passed. Ethan remained silent. Victor had spent over $3 million on specialists. He'd flown in experts from Switzerland, Japan, and Australia. He'd tried experimental therapies, cutting-edge treatments, and alternative medicine. He'd begged, bargained, and bullied his way through every option available to modern science. Nothing worked. His son would look at him with those intelligent, knowing eyes. Eyes that held entire universes of thoughts and feelings and communicate through nods, through writing, through gestures, but never through words. And slowly, painfully, Victor began to accept that his son's voice was gone forever. Grace Mbutu arrived at the Harrington penthouse on a Tuesday morning in March. She was 48 years old, with skin the color of rich mahogany and hands that told stories of a lifetime of work. Her accent carried the melodic rhythms of her native Nigeria, mixed with 15 years of life in New York City. She wore a simple blue dress, practical shoes, and carried a single bag containing everything she owned. The agency had sent her after Victor's previous housekeeper, the fourth one in 2 years, quit without notice. Apparently, working for the Harrington household was impossible. The child was strange. The father was never satisfied. Grace didn't care about rumors. She needed this job. 15 years ago, she had come to America with her husband, Samuel, and their daughter, Amara. They had dreams, the same dreams that brought millions to these shores. A better life. A brighter future. A chance. But America had not been kind to the Mbutu family. Samuel had died of cancer 8 years ago, leaving Grace with hospital bills that seemed to multiply like weeds. Amara had gotten a scholarship to Columbia University, but still needed help with living expenses. So, Grace cleaned houses. She cooked meals. She washed clothes and scrubbed floors and smiled when people looked through her like she was invisible. Because that's what people like her were supposed to do. Be invisible. Be silent. Be grateful. Standing in the elevator of the Harrington building, Grace smoothed her dress and whispered a quiet prayer. She needed this job. She would do whatever it took to keep it. The elevator doors opened to reveal a penthouse that looked like something from a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Manhattan skyline. Modern art worth millions hung on pristine white walls. Everything gleamed with cold, expensive perfection. A woman in a crisp gray suit stood waiting. Her name was Patricia Wells, Victor Harrington's personal assistant, and her expression suggested she had just discovered something unpleasant on her designer shoe. "You're the new housekeeper?" Patricia's gaze swept over Grace with barely concealed disdain. "The agency said you had experience." 22 years of experience, ma'am." Grace kept her voice steady. "I have references from, I don't need your life story." Patricia cut her off with a wave of her manicured hand. "Mr. Harrington is rarely home. When he is, you're to be invisible. The child—" She paused, her lips thinning. "The child has issues. Don't try to engage with him. Don't look at him. Don't expect him to respond to anything you say. He doesn't speak." Grace felt something shift in her chest. "He doesn't speak?" "Selective mutism." Patricia pronounced the words with clinical detachment. "He's been mute for years. Frankly, he gives everyone the creeps, just staring with those eyes. Do your job. Stay out of the way, and we won't have problems. Understood?" "Understood," Grace said quietly. But as Patricia walked away, clicking across the marble in her expensive heels, Grace felt the first stirring of something she couldn't quite name. She had come here to clean a house. She hadn't expected to find a child who had lost his voice. Grace found Ethan in the library. It was a magnificent room, walls lined with leather-bound books, a fireplace that probably cost more than her annual salary, and windows that framed the city like living artwork. The boy sat in a window seat, his small body curled into itself, his forehead pressed against the glass. He was watching the pigeons on the ledge outside, his finger tracing their movements with intense concentration. Grace stood in the doorway, her cleaning supplies in hand, and simply watched. There was something about the way he observed those birds, something careful, something hungry, like he was memorizing every flutter of their wings, every tilt of their heads, every small moment of their simple lives. He wasn't staring into nothing. He was drinking in everything. "Hello there," Grace said softly. The boy didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence. But Grace saw his finger pause, just for a moment, on the glass. She didn't push. She didn't approach. She simply began cleaning the room, dusting the shelves, straightening the books, humming softly to herself. It was an old song, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing in their village, back when Grace was young and the world was still full of wonder. She hadn't thought about that song in years. But here, in this cold, magnificent room with its silent child, it rose to her lips unbidden. She hummed the melody as she worked, her voice low and warm, filling the silence with something almost like comfort. And as she hummed, she noticed something. Ethan's finger had started moving again. But this time, it wasn't tracing the pigeons. It was moving in rhythm with her song. Grace's heart caught in her throat. She kept humming, kept watching from the corner of her eye, and saw the boy's shoulders so tight, so tense, begin to soften. When she finished cleaning and left the room, she looked back one last time. Ethan had turned from the window. He was looking at her, not through her, not past her, at her, and in his eyes, Grace saw something she recognized. She saw a child who was trapped inside himself, screaming in silence, desperate for anyone to see him, to really see him. The next few weeks revealed the true nature of the Harrington household. Victor was almost never home. When he was, he moved through the penthouse like a ghost, haunted by grief and guilt and failure. He would stand outside Ethan's door at night, his hand raised as if to knock, but he never did. He would look at his son across the breakfast table with eyes full of desperate love, but the words that might have bridged the gap between them never came. He didn't know what to say to a child who couldn't answer. So he said nothing at all. The staff treated Ethan like a problem to be managed. His nanny, a stern woman named Mrs. Whitmore, believed in strict schedules, minimal interaction, and not encouraging his condition. She spoke about him in the third person, even when he was in the room, as if his silence made him deaf as well as mute. "The boy needs his lunch at noon," she would tell Grace. "The boy should be in bed by 8. The boy shouldn't be stimulated. The boy." Never his name. Never Ethan. Patricia Wells was worse. She openly called him creepy and disturbing. She complained to Victor about having to deal with his son, as if Ethan were a burden rather than a child. And the parade of specialists who came and went, they looked at Ethan like a puzzle to be solved, a case study to be analyzed, a problem to be fixed. None of them saw the boy. None of them saw the intelligence sparkling behind those silent eyes. None of them saw the way his fingers danced when he was thinking, or how his face lit up when the afternoon sun hit the library windows just right, or how he carefully arranged his toys not in random patterns, but in complex geometric sequences that would have amazed mathematicians. None of them saw, but Grace saw. Grace saw everything. It started with small things. Grace began leaving little gifts where Ethan would find them: a perfect seashell from a dollar store, a feather she'd found in Central Park, a paper airplane she'd folded from a magazine page. She never gave them to him directly. She simply placed them in his path, like breadcrumbs, leading somewhere secret. And Ethan collected them all. She saw them arranged on his windowsill one morning, positioned with careful precision: the shell, the feather, the airplane, and a dozen other tiny treasures she'd left over the weeks. He had organized them by color, then by size, creating a pattern that spiraled inward like a galaxy. Grace smiled and left a small prism in the library that day. She started talking to him, too. Not in the forced, artificial way the specialists did, with their leading questions and their expectant silences. She talked the way she would talk to anyone sharing stories about her day, commenting on the weather, wondering aloud about the lives of the pigeons he loved so much. "Do you think they have families?" she asked one afternoon, dusting near his window seat. "The pigeons? I like to imagine they go home to little pigeon apartments with tiny pigeon furniture. And they tell their children about the strange humans they saw today." Ethan didn't respond. But Grace saw the corner of his mouth twitch, almost a smile. Almost. She began singing more openly, not just humming, but singing the full songs of her childhood. Songs in Yoruba, songs in English, songs that mixed both languages in the way her grandmother used to mix them, flowing from one to the other like water. And every time she sang, she noticed Ethan moving to her rhythm, his fingers tapping, his feet swaying, his whole body responding to the music, even though his voice remained locked away. Mrs. Whitmore noticed. "What are you doing?" she demanded one afternoon, catching Grace singing while she swept the hallway outside Ethan's playroom. "Just singing, ma'am. Makes the work go faster." "Well, stop it. You're disturbing the boy." Grace looked through the doorway at Ethan, who had been tracing patterns on the floor with his finger in time to her song. He had stopped when Mrs. Whitmore spoke, his body going rigid, the brief spark of life fading from his posture. "Yes, ma'am," Grace said quietly. But when Mrs. Whitmore left, Grace started humming again, softer this time, just for Ethan. And slowly, carefully, his fingers began to move once more. 3 months after Grace arrived, everything changed. It was a Saturday afternoon. Victor was home for once, locked in his study, with a phone pressed to his ear, dealing with some crisis at the company. Mrs. Whitmore had the day off. The penthouse was quiet. Grace was cleaning the kitchen when she heard a crash, followed by the sharp sound of glass shattering. She ran. She found Ethan in the living room, frozen in the middle of the floor. Behind him, one of Victor's prized sculptures, a modern art piece worth at least $100,000, lay shattered on the marble. The boy's eyes were wide with terror. His hands were shaking. He was pressed against the wall like he was trying to disappear into it. "Ethan," Grace said softly, moving slowly toward him. "It's okay. It's just a thing. Things can be replaced." But the door to Victor's study was already opening. Victor emerged, his phone forgotten, his face a mask of stress and exhaustion, and then he saw the sculpture. What the hell? He stopped when he saw Ethan against the wall. His expression shifted through a complicated series of emotions: shock, anger, disappointment, and underneath it all, a deep and terrible helplessness. Ethan, Victor's voice was tight. What did you do? The boy shrank smaller against the wall. His eyes darted to Grace, then back to his father. And Grace saw something she recognized. She saw a child who wanted desperately to explain, who wanted desperately to speak, who was trying so hard to force words out of a throat that refused to cooperate. Mr. Harrington, Grace stepped forward. It was an accident. I was cleaning, and I'm not speaking to you. Victor's voice was sharp, cold. He didn't even look at her. Ethan, look at me. This is the third thing you've broken this month. We've talked about being careful. We've talked about... He stopped. His jaw worked. Grace saw the moment when the full weight of his words hit him, the impossibility of what he was asking from a child who couldn't respond. Never mind, Victor said, his voice suddenly deflated. Just... never mind. He turned and walked back to his study, closing the door behind him. In the silence that followed, Ethan began to cry. Not out loud, his tears were as silent as everything else about him, but they streamed down his face, pooling at his chin, dripping onto the floor amid the shattered remains of a sculpture that no one would remember in a year. Grace crossed the room and knelt before him. She didn't touch him. She had learned that unexpected touch made him flinch. But she put herself at his level, her eyes meeting his. Look at me, little one, she said softly. Look at me. Ethan's tear-filled eyes found hers. You are not broken, Grace said. Do you hear me? You are not broken. You are not wrong. You are not less. You are a whole person, a brilliant person, a beautiful person, and your silence does not make you any less worthy of love. The boy's breath hitched. More tears fell. I see you, Ethan Harrington. Grace's voice was fierce and gentle all at once. I see you. And I will keep seeing you. Even when no one else does. Do you understand? For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Ethan nodded. And then so quickly, she almost missed it. His hand reached out and touched hers. Just for a second. Just the briefest contact. But it was the first time he had willingly touched anyone since the accident. Grace felt tears prick her own eyes. That's right, she whispered. That's right, little one. I see you. From that day forward, everything changed. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. Patricia Wells had been watching Grace with growing suspicion. The housekeeper was overstepping, spending too much time with the boy, talking to him like he was normal, singing those strange foreign songs that echoed through the penthouse. It was inappropriate. It was disruptive. It needed to stop. Patricia had worked for Victor Harrington for 8 years. She had weathered the tragedy of Caroline's death, the nightmare of Ethan's condition, the slow dissolution of the man she secretly loved into a shell of grief and work. She had been waiting patiently, carefully for Victor to emerge from his darkness and finally see what had been in front of him all along. Her. But instead of turning to Patricia for comfort, Victor seemed to be pulling away. And the only new variable was the African housekeeper who had forgotten her place. I've noticed Grace spending quite a bit of time with Ethan, Patricia mentioned casually one evening as Victor reviewed documents in his study. I'm not sure that's appropriate. Victor looked up, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? Well, she's just the cleaning staff. But she seems to think she's some kind of, I don't know, therapist? She's always talking to him, singing to him. It's strange. Unprofessional. Has Ethan complained? Patricia blinked. He can't complain. He doesn't speak. Has he shown any signs of distress? Has Mrs. Whitmore reported any problems? No. But, then, I don't see the issue. Victor returned to his documents. Let her sing. God knows this place could use some life in it. Patricia's smile tightened. Of course, Victor. I was just concerned about boundaries. She left the study with her dignity intact but her mind churning. If Victor wouldn't listen to gentle suggestions, she would have to find another way. She started keeping notes. 6 months after Grace arrived, something extraordinary happened. It was a rainy afternoon, and Grace was cleaning Ethan's playroom while he sat on the floor, working on one of his elaborate block structures. The boy had an incredible gift for spatial reasoning. His constructions were complex, balanced, almost architectural. Grace was singing an old Yoruba lullaby, one she had sung to Amara when she was small. The melody was simple, repetitive, comforting, and over the months, it had become Ethan's favorite. She didn't even notice when the boy's hands stopped moving. She didn't notice when he turned to watch her, his eyes fixed on her face with unusual intensity. She didn't notice until she heard it. A sound, a soft, barely there sound, coming from Ethan's direction. Grace stopped singing. She turned, hardly daring to breathe. Ethan's mouth was open, his lips were moving, and he was humming. The same melody, the same lullaby. The first sound he had made in 4 years, emerging rough and unpracticed from his throat. Barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably, impossibly, real. Grace's cleaning cloth slipped from her fingers. Her hand flew to her mouth, but she forced herself not to react too dramatically. She had read about selective mutism. She knew that pressure could cause regression, that the wrong response could slam the door shut again. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She kept singing. She picked up the melody where she had left off, her voice trembling slightly, and she kept singing. And Ethan, brave, brilliant, beautiful Ethan, kept humming alongside her. They stayed like that for almost 20 minutes. 2 voices, one barely more than a whisper, weaving together in an ancient lullaby. And when Grace finally had to stop, when her voice gave out and her tears overwhelmed her, she looked at Ethan and saw something she had never seen before. He was smiling. A real smile. A full smile. The smile of a child who had just discovered that his voice hadn't abandoned him after all. It was still there. It had been waiting for someone to show him it was safe to use it again. Grace knelt before him, her face wet with tears, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Ethan," she whispered, "you wonderful, wonderful boy. You did it. You found your voice." Ethan looked at her, and then, in a voice rusty with disuse, cracking and quiet but present, he said a single word. Grace. Her name. Her name on his lips. The first word he had spoken in 4 years. Grace Mbutu broke down sobbing. And in a penthouse high above Manhattan, where silence had reigned for so long, the first crack of light broke through the darkness. "Get out." Victor Harrington's voice was ice. His eyes, usually so tired and distant, blazed with cold fury. "Mr. Harrington, please," Grace began. "I said get out." The words echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. "Security will escort you from the building. You will not receive a reference. You will not come near my son again. Do you understand me?" Grace stood frozen in the foyer, her small bag clutched in her hands, her world collapsing around her. Behind Victor, Patricia Wells smiled. And somewhere in his bedroom, Ethan Harrington pressed his hands against the door, trying desperately to reach the one person who had ever truly seen him. But his voice, so newly found, so fragile and small, failed him. He opened his mouth to scream, to call for Grace, to beg his father to stop. And nothing came out. The silence swallowed everything. How did it come to this? The weeks following Ethan's first word were nothing short of miraculous. At first, Grace told no one. She didn't trust anyone in the household, not Mrs. Whitmore with her cold efficiency, not Patricia with her barely concealed contempt, not even Victor, who seemed to exist in a perpetual state of distracted grief. Instead, she and Ethan built something precious together. Every day, in quiet moments when they were alone, they practiced. Grace would sing, and Ethan would hum along. She would say words, and he would shape them silently with his lips, learning the feeling of them, the weight of them, before attempting to give them sound. It was slow. It was painstaking. Some days, nothing would come. Ethan would try to speak, and his throat would close up, panic flashing in his eyes. And Grace would simply hold his hands and tell him it was okay. They would try again tomorrow. There was no rush. He was doing beautifully. Progress isn't a straight line. She told him one afternoon, after a particularly frustrating session where he couldn't produce a single sound. It's more like a spiral staircase. Sometimes you feel like you're going in circles, but you're actually climbing higher with every step. You just can't see it yet. Ethan nodded slowly. Then, in the halting, scratchy voice that still made Grace's heart soar every time she heard it, he asked, "Promise? Promise, little one, I promise." By the third week, Ethan had a vocabulary of about 20 words. Simple words: Grace, yes, no, bird, book, song, want, more, please, but each one felt like a victory against years of silence. By the fifth week, he was stringing words together. Phrases, simple sentences. Bird is pretty. Want more songs. Grace, stay please. That last one broke her heart every time. And still, she told no one. She knew what would happen if she did. The specialists would descend. The schedules would change. Everything would become about therapy and progress and measurable outcomes. And somewhere in that clinical chaos, the fragile trust she had built with Ethan would shatter. He wasn't ready for that yet. Neither was she. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, and the Harrington household was full of watching eyes. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Victor had come home early, a rare occurrence, prompted by a migraine that no amount of medication could touch. He had retreated to his darkened bedroom, trying to sleep off the pounding in his skull, when a sound made him pause. Voices. From Ethan's playroom. Victor's first thought was that one of the specialists had arrived unannounced. His second thought, darker, more suspicious, was that someone unauthorized had entered the penthouse. He moved silently down the hallway, his head still throbbing, and stopped outside the playroom door, which stood slightly ajar. What he saw made him forget how to breathe. Grace was sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing Ethan. Between them was a collection of picture cards, animals, objects, colors, spread in a careful pattern. "Can you tell me what this one is?" Grace asked, holding up a card with a yellow sun. Ethan looked at it, his brow furrowed in concentration, his mouth opened. "Sun," he said. "Sunday yellow sun." Victor's hand shot out to grip the doorframe. His knees went weak. His vision blurred not from the migraine, but from something else entirely. His son's voice, his son's voice. After 4 years of silence, after 4 years of watching his child trapped inside himself, after 4 years of grief and guilt and helpless, impotent rage, his son was speaking. "That's wonderful." Grace was beaming at Ethan. "And this one?" She held up a card with a red apple. "Apple," Ethan said, more confidently this time. "Red. Apple is red. Perfect. Oh, Ethan, you're doing so well. Your father is going to be so." "Father sad?" The words cut through Grace's praise. She paused, her smile faltering. "What do you mean, little one?" Ethan's small face was serious. "Father's sad. Always sad. Because of me." "No, no, no." Grace reached out and took his hands. "Your father isn't sad because of you. He's sad because he misses your mother. He's sad because he doesn't know how to help you, and that makes him feel powerless. But he loves you, Ethan, so much, he just doesn't know how to show it." "Father not talk to me." "I know. But maybe when he finds out you can talk now, things will change. Maybe this will help him find his way back to you." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Grace, tell him, Father?" Grace hesitated. Victor, watching from the doorway, held his breath. "I think," Grace said slowly, "that it should be you who tells him. When you're ready. This is your voice, Ethan. Your miracle. You should be the one to share it." Victor pressed his back against the wall outside the room, his hand over his mouth to contain the sound that wanted to escape, something between a sob and a laugh. His son could speak. His son could speak. And it was the housekeeper, the woman he barely noticed, the woman he had looked through 100 times, who had given him back his boy. Victor didn't confront Grace that day. He couldn't. He needed to process what he had witnessed. He needed to understand how this had happened, what it meant, what he should do. That night, after the penthouse was quiet and everyone had gone to bed, Victor did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He knocked on Ethan's door. "Come in." The words were barely above a whisper, but they were words, and Victor had to steady himself before entering. Ethan was in bed, his nightlight casting soft shadows across his face. His eyes, those intelligent, watchful eyes, found his father in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Victor crossed the room and sat on the edge of his son's bed. His hands were shaking. His voice, when it came, was rough with emotion. "I heard you today," he said quietly. "I heard you talking with Grace." Ethan's eyes went wide. A flash of fear crossed his face, the instinctive terror of a child who had spent years trying to meet impossible expectations. "I'm not angry," Victor said quickly. "Ethan, I'm not angry. I'm—" He stopped, struggling to find words. "I'm amazed. I'm so proud of you. He couldn't continue. The tears came too fast, too overwhelming to speak through. And Victor would remember this moment for the rest of his life. His son reached out. Ethan's small hand found his father's face, touching the tears that streamed down his cheeks. "Father crying," Ethan said. "Not sad?" "No, buddy." Victor's voice cracked. "Not sad. Happy. These are happy tears. Do you understand? You made me happy." Hearing your voice, he had to stop again, choking on emotion. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Ethan considered this. Then, with the careful deliberation of a child choosing his words precisely, "I talk slow, words hard, but Grace help. Grace see me." "I know." Victor nodded, wiping his eyes. "I know she does. And I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry I didn't see you the way she does. I've been so lost in my own pain that I forgot." He had to stop, had to breathe. "I forgot that you were hurting too, that you needed me, and I wasn't there. Father here now?" The question was simple, hopeful, heartbreaking. Victor pulled his son into his arms, the first real embrace they had shared since Caroline's funeral, and held him tight. "Yes," he whispered fiercely. "Yes, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise." They stayed like that for a long time, father and son, both crying, both healing, both finding their way back to each other through the darkness. And when Victor finally left his son's room that night, he went straight to his study and pulled up Grace Mbutu's personnel file. He had a lot of catching up to do. What Victor discovered about Grace Mbutu surprised him. She had a master's degree in child psychology from the University of Lagos. She had spent 15 years in Nigeria working with traumatized children, orphans of violence, survivors of loss, kids whose voices had been stolen by circumstance and horror. She was not just the cleaning staff. She was exactly the person his son had needed. But the file also revealed darker truths: immigration struggles, financial devastation after her husband's death, a daughter who had nearly dropped out of Colombia because they couldn't afford her living expenses, years of working jobs far beneath her qualifications because no one in America would recognize her credentials or see past her accent and her skin. Grace Mbutu had been invisible her entire time in this country. And still she had seen his son when no one else could. Victor stayed up all night, thinking. By morning, he had made several decisions. First, he called his personal physician and arranged for a quiet consultation with a childhood development specialist he trusted, not one of the parade of clinical strangers who had paraded through Ethan's life, but a compassionate expert who could guide Grace's approach and help protect his son's fragile progress. Second, he called his accountant and set up an educational fund. Grace's daughter would have her Columbia expenses paid in full: tuition, housing, books, everything, with no strings attached. Third, he drafted a new contract for Grace, one that recognized her true qualifications, one that made her Ethan's official therapeutic companion, with appropriate salary, benefits, and respect. He would tell her that morning. He would thank her properly. He would make sure she knew that her value had finally been seen. But when morning came, Patricia Wells arrived first. And she had plans of her own. Patricia had been watching. She had noticed Victor's late-night visit to Ethan's room. She had noticed the change in his demeanor the next morning, the lightness that hadn't been there before, the strange hope in his eyes. She had noticed, and she had investigated, and she had discovered the truth. The African housekeeper had somehow gotten the mute child to speak. For anyone else, this would have been wonderful news. But Patricia saw only threat. For 8 years, she had positioned herself as indispensable to Victor Harrington. She had managed his schedule, filtered his communications, handled his personal affairs. She had been waiting patient as a spider for the fog of his grief to lift, so he would finally notice her. But now there was Grace. Grace, who had accomplished what millions of dollars and dozens of specialists could not. Grace, who Victor was looking at with new eyes. Grace, who could ruin everything. Patricia began her counterattack subtly. A whisper here. I've heard that some people from her country use unorthodox methods with children. Cultural practices that wouldn't be appropriate here. An observation there. Have you noticed how possessive she's become of Ethan? It's almost like she's trying to drive a wedge between him and the rest of the staff. A suggestion, planted carefully. She's been in this country illegally for a while, hasn't she? Or something more. Financial? Victor dismissed these comments at first. But Patricia was skilled at her work. She knew how to plant seeds of doubt that would grow in dark corners of the mind. And then she played her MasterCard. She fabricated evidence. A receipt for expensive jewelry, accidentally discovered in Grace's room. A browser history showing research into wealthy single fathers and how to manipulate grieving families. A recorded phone call spliced together from innocent conversations that made it sound like Grace was bragging about getting close to the Harrington money. It was all lies. Every piece of it, carefully constructed and utterly false. But Patricia presented it to Victor on the same morning he had planned to offer Grace a new contract. And Victor, exhausted, traumatized, still healing from years of grief, looked at the evidence and felt his newly kindled hope turn to ash in his chest. Had he been played? Had this all been a manipulation? Was Grace Mbutu just another person trying to use his son to get to his fortune? Grace knew something was wrong the moment she entered the penthouse that morning. Victor was waiting in the foyer. His face was stone. Patricia stood behind him, her expression carefully composed into a mask of concern. Mr. Harrington? Grace set down her bag, her instincts screaming alarm. Is everything all right? How long? Victor's voice was flat. Dangerous. I'm sorry? How long have you been planning this? Was it from the beginning? Or did you see an opportunity when you realized my son was vulnerable? Grace felt the blood drain from her face. I don't understand. Don't. The word was a whip crack. Don't play innocent with me. I saw the evidence. The jewelry receipts. The internet searches. The phone calls. What evidence? Mr. Harrington, I have no idea what you're talking about. Victor's jaw tightened. He pulled a folder from the table behind him and threw it at her feet. Papers scattered across the marble printouts, photos, transcripts. Grace knelt to look at them, her hands shaking. What she saw made her stomach turn. It was all fake. She could see that immediately. The jewelry receipt bore a signature that looked nothing like hers. The browser history included searches she had never made. The phone call transcript was cobbled together from fragments of real conversations, twisted to mean something completely different. This isn't real, she said, looking up at Victor with desperate eyes. This is fabricated. Someone has... Who, Grace? Who would fabricate evidence against you? Victor laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're a housekeeper. No one cares enough about you to frame you. The words hit her like a physical blow. No one cares enough about you. 15 years in this country. And she was still nothing. Still invisible. Still so insignificant that the idea of someone targeting her was apparently laughable. Grace stood slowly, her back straightened, her chin lifted. I have spent my life caring for children, she said quietly. In Nigeria, I worked with boys and girls, who had lost everything, their parents, their homes, their hope. I helped them find their voices when the world had tried to silence them. I did this work for 20 years, and I never asked for a single thing in return except the privilege of seeing them heal. Her voice grew stronger. Your son was drowning, Mr. Harrington. He was drowning in this cold, beautiful prison you built, surrounded by people who saw him as a problem to be managed. I saw a child who was screaming in silence, and I did what I have always done. I listened. I saw him. I showed him that his voice mattered, even when no one else would. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice didn't waver. I don't want your money. I never wanted your money. I wanted to help a little boy who reminded me of all the children I've loved over the years, children who deserved better than what the world gave them. She pointed at the scattered papers. This is not me. Someone has lied to you. And if you cannot see that, if you choose to believe this poison over everything I have shown you through my actions, then you don't deserve the miracle that your son is becoming. Silence fell over the foyer. Victor's face was unreadable. Behind him, Patricia's mask had slipped slightly, a flicker of unease crossing her features. Then Victor spoke the words that ended everything. Get out. Get out. Victor Harrington's voice was ice. His eyes, usually so tired and distant, blazed with cold fury. Mr. Harrington, please, Grace began. I said, get out. The words echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. Security will escort you from the building. You will not receive a reference. You will not come near my son again. Do you understand me? Grace stood frozen in the foyer, her small bag clutched in her hands, her world collapsing around her. Behind Victor, Patricia Wells smiled. And somewhere in his bedroom, Ethan Harrington pressed his hands against the door, trying desperately to reach the one person who had ever truly seen him. But his voice, so newly found, so fragile and small, failed him. He had heard the shouting. He had crept to his door, pressed his ear against the wood, and heard every terrible word. He had heard his father accuse Grace of things that weren't true. He had heard Grace defending herself, her voice breaking. He had heard his father say, "No one cares enough about you." And now he was trying to scream, trying to open his door, run to his father, tell him the truth. Grace was good. Grace was kind. Grace loved him. Grace made him feel safe, for the first time since Mommy died. But his throat closed up. His hand couldn't turn the knob. His body wouldn't cooperate. The trauma came flooding back. The fear, the helplessness, the suffocating silence that had been his prison for 4 years. In trying to save Grace, Ethan lost everything he had gained. His voice disappeared again. And this time, Grace wasn't there to help him find it. Grace walked out of the Harrington building in a daze. Security escorted her to the lobby, watched as she retrieved her things from her locker, and made sure she exited through the service entrance the way she had come in, invisible and unimportant, just another servant who had outlived her usefulness. She stood on the sidewalk, her bag in her hands, and watched the traffic flow past. What now? She had no job, no reference, no way to prove her innocence. And Ethan, God, Ethan, what would happen to him now? Who would sing to him? Who would see him? Who would remind him that his voice mattered, that he wasn't broken, that he was worthy of love? Grace walked for a long time that day. Through Central Park, past the playgrounds where children laughed and shouted, along the reservoir where joggers ran in endless circles. She walked until her feet ached and the sun began to set and the city lights started their nightly dance. Then she went home. Her apartment was small, a studio in the Bronx that she shared with too many memories and not enough space. Photos of Samuel lined the walls. Amara's childhood drawings were still taped to the refrigerator. Everything in this space reminded her of what she had lost, and what she had built, and what she still hoped to protect. She sat on her bed and called her daughter. "Mama?" Amara's voice was warm and worried. "You sound strange. Is everything okay?" "I lost my job today." Silence on the other end. Then, what happened? Grace told her everything. The boy. The breakthrough. The lies. The accusations. When she finished, Amara was quiet for a long moment. Mama, she finally said, you need to fight this. How? They have evidence. Mr. Harrington believes it. No one will take my word over theirs. You have something better than evidence, Amara said fiercely. You have truth. And you have a son who can speak now, because of you. That child knows what you did for him. That child is proof. He's 7 years old, baby. And his father won't let me near him. Then find another way. Make noise. Tell your story. Don't let them bury you in silence. Grace closed her eyes. She was so tired. So tired of fighting, of proving herself, of trying to be seen in a world that was designed to overlook people like her. But her daughter was right. She couldn't give up. Not on herself. And not on Ethan. In the weeks that followed Grace's departure, the Harrington household fell apart. Ethan stopped speaking entirely. Not just to his father, to everyone. He retreated into a silence even deeper than before, refusing to engage with the specialists Victor brought in, ignoring Mrs. Whitmore's rigid schedules, sitting by his window for hours, watching the pigeons and responding to nothing. He stopped eating properly. He stopped sleeping through the night. He began having nightmares that sent him screaming silent screams, his mouth open but no sound emerging into the darkness. Victor was frantic. He called every expert he could find. He tried new therapies, new approaches, new medications. Nothing worked. His son was slipping away, retreating into some inner world, where Victor couldn't follow. What happened? He demanded of Mrs. Whitmore. He was making progress. He was speaking. What changed? Mrs. Whitmore pursed her lips. The housekeeper was filling his head with nonsense, sir. African songs and inappropriate emotional attachments. The boy became dependent on her, and now he's experiencing withdrawal. It's to be expected. To be expected? Victor stared at her. My son is catatonic, and you think that's to be expected? Children are resilient. He'll adjust. But Ethan didn't adjust. He deteriorated. And as Victor watched his son fade, a terrible doubt began to grow in his mind. What if he had been wrong? What if Grace had been telling the truth? What if he had just destroyed the one person who could save his child? Patricia Wells was pleased with her victory. With Grace gone, she had Victor's attention again. She positioned herself as his confidant, his support system, the steady presence who helped him navigate his son's crisis. These things take time, she assured him, her hand lingering on his arm. Ethan will come around. You just need to be patient. And to surround yourself with people you can trust. But Patricia made a mistake. She got careless. Confident in her success, she began to drop her mask around the household staff. She made snide comments about Grace within earshot of the kitchen workers. She bragged to a fellow assistant about dealing with the housekeeper problem. She left her laptop open on her desk when she stepped away for coffee. And someone noticed. Maria Santos had worked in the Harrington kitchen for 3 years. She was quiet, efficient, easily overlooked, much like Grace had been. But Maria had eyes. Maria had ears. And Maria had liked Grace Mbutu. One evening, when Patricia was occupied on a phone call, Maria walked past her office. The laptop screen glowed in the dim room. And there, open in a browser tab, was a website Maria recognized. One of those services that created fake documents, receipts, transcripts, phone records. Maria's heart began to pound. She knew she should walk away. She knew that getting involved could cost her her job, her livelihood, everything she had worked for. But she also knew what Patricia had done, and she knew what it had cost. That night, Maria sent an anonymous email to Victor Harrington's personal address, an address she only knew because she had once delivered a misrouted package to his study. Check Patricia Wells's browser history, the email said. Check her search terms. Check the sites she's visited. Then ask yourself who really betrayed your son. Victor read the email at 2 a.m., unable to sleep as usual, and he began to dig. What Victor found destroyed everything he thought he knew. Patricia's computer held the evidence of her betrayal search, histories she had forgotten to clear, drafts of fake documents, a detailed timeline of her scheme to remove Grace from the household. There was more. Years of manipulations, carefully concealed. Times Patricia had intercepted communications, sabotaged relationships, isolated Victor from anyone who might have helped him heal. She had been engineering his loneliness. She had been cultivating his dependence. And when Grace threatened to awaken him from his grief, Patricia had eliminated her with surgical precision. Victor sat in his study, surrounded by printouts and screenshots, and felt something crack open inside him. He had done this. He had believed the lies. He had sent Grace away. He had broken the only connection his son had found in 4 years. And for what? For a woman who had been manipulating him all along? He thought about Grace's face when he told her to leave. The dignity in her posture, even as tears streamed down her cheeks. The truth in her words that he had been too blind to see. I wanted to help a little boy who reminded me of all the children I've loved over the years, children who deserved better than what the world gave them. She had been telling the truth, and he had thrown her away like garbage. Victor Harrington had built a $47 billion empire through intelligence, determination, and an unfailing instinct for the truth. But when it mattered most, when his son's happiness hung in the balance, he had failed. He picked up his phone. It was time to make things right. The hospital room was too white, too quiet, too final. Ethan Harrington lay motionless in the bed, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped and hummed and measured the fragile thread of his existence. He hadn't eaten in 8 days. He hadn't moved in 4. He hadn't made a sound in 2 weeks. The doctors used words like severe catatonic episode and psychological shutdown and unresponsive to stimuli. They talked about feeding tubes and long-term care and the possibility that he might never come back. Victor Harrington sat beside his son's bed, holding a small hand that felt like paper, fragile, hollow, ready to tear. "Please," he whispered into the silence. "Please come back to me. I'll do anything. I'll give anything. Just please." His voice broke. Behind him, the door opened, and a woman's voice, warm, accented, achingly familiar, began to sing. A Yoruba lullaby, the one from the beginning, the one that had first cracked the silence. And in the bed, for the first time in weeks, Ethan's finger moved. Finding Grace Mbutu proved more difficult than Victor anticipated. She had no listed phone number. Her last known address, a studio apartment in the Bronx, had been vacated 3 days after her dismissal. She had no social media presence, no professional website, no digital footprint that Victor's considerable resources could trace. It was as if she had simply disappeared. "Keep looking," Victor ordered his private investigators. "I don't care what it costs. Find her." But as the days passed and Ethan's condition worsened, Victor began to lose hope, until Amara Mbutu walked into his office. She was 22 years old, with her mother's fierce intelligence and a backbone made of steel. She had walked past Victor's security team, ignored his receptionist's objections, and planted herself in front of his desk like she had every right to be there. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "I'm Grace's daughter, and I have some things to say to you." Victor stared at her. "How did you get in here?" "I told your receptionist that I had information about a fraud investigation, which is true, in a sense." Amara's eyes were hard. "Patricia Wells committed fraud against my mother, fabricated evidence, defamation of character. I could go to the police. I could go to the press. I could make this story very public, very fast." Victor's face went pale. "I didn't know. You didn't want to know. It was easier to believe the lies than to question them. Easier to throw away the person who saved your son than to examine why she made you uncomfortable." "I was wrong," Victor said quietly. "I know that now. Words are easy, Mr. Harrington. Actions matter." Amara leaned forward. "You want my mother back? You'll have to earn her. And not with money. She's never cared about that. You'll have to convince her that you see her now. Really see her. Because if you're just going to look through her again the moment it's convenient, she'd rather starve than come back." "What do I have to do?" Amara studied him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because her expression softened slightly. "She's staying with a friend in Queens. I'll give you the address. But Mr. Harrington, she paused at the door. If you hurt her again, I will make you regret it. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Victor said. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something like hope. Victor found Grace in a modest house in Jackson Heights, living with a Nigerian family she had known from her early days in America. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, her face went through a complicated series of emotions: surprise, pain, anger, and finally a kind of weary resignation. Mr. Harrington, she said flatly, have you come to accuse me of something else? I've come to apologize. Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. Apologize? Do you know what your accusation cost me? I have been blacklisted by every agency in the city. No one will hire me. I am surviving on the charity of friends while my daughter works 2 jobs to help pay my bills. An apology does not undo that. No, Victor agreed. It doesn't. But I want to try. He told her everything. The anonymous email. The investigation. The discovery of Patricia's manipulation. The evidence he had gathered, which proved definitively that Grace had been framed. I have pressed charges against Patricia, he said. She has been arrested. The evidence will be made public. Your name will be cleared. Grace listened in silence. When he finished, she asked, And Ethan? Victor's face crumbled. He stopped, tried again. He stopped speaking after you left. Completely. He's worse than before, much worse. The doctors, his voice broke. The doctors say he's withdrawing from reality. They're talking about institutional care, long-term facilities. They're saying he might never come back. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. This is my fault, Victor continued, his voice raw. All of it. I was so lost in my own pain, so afraid of being used or betrayed again, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. And now my son is slipping away, and I don't know how to save him. He fell to his knees on her doorstep. This billionaire, this titan of industry, this man who had never begged for anything in his life. Please, he whispered. Please help me save my son. I'll give you anything. Whatever you want. Whatever it takes. Just please, please don't let him disappear. Grace looked down at the broken man before her. She thought about everything he had taken from her. The job, the dignity, the weeks of fear and struggle and shame. But she also thought about Ethan, about his finger tracing patterns on the window, about his first hum note, rusty and uncertain, about the word grace emerging from his small mouth like a gift. She had loved that boy. Some things mattered more than pride. Get up, Mr. Harrington, she said quietly. Victor looked up at her, hope and fear warring in his eyes. Take me to my boy. The hospital room was too white, too quiet, too final. Grace stood in the doorway, her heart breaking at what she saw. Ethan had lost weight. His already small frame had become gaunt, his skin pale and paper-thin. He lay motionless in the bed, his eyes open but seeing nothing, staring at a ceiling that couldn't stare back. Monitors beeped their mechanical rhythms. Nurses moved in quiet efficiency. Everything felt sterile and hopeless and wrong. They want to insert a feeding tube tomorrow, Victor said from behind her. He hasn't eaten anything solid in 8 days. He won't respond to anyone. The psychiatrists say, I do not care what they say, Grace said firmly. She walked into the room and stopped beside Ethan's bed. She didn't speak, didn't call his name, didn't try to shake him awake or beg him to respond. Instead, she started to sing the Yoruba lullaby, the one from the beginning, the song of her grandmother, of her village, of the warm nights when the world was simple and safe and full of stars. Her voice was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it filled the cold hospital room like sunlight, like warmth, like something sacred that machines could never measure. She sang the first verse, the second, the familiar melody rising and falling like breathing, like heartbeats, like the tide coming home to the shore. And on the third verse, Ethan's finger moved, just a twitch, just the barest flutter of motion. But Grace saw it. She kept singing, kept the melody flowing, and watched as Ethan's hand began to move more deliberately. His finger tapped against the blanket in the rhythm she had taught him. Tap, 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 tap. The pattern they had practiced together, 100 afternoons in a penthouse library. The monitors began to change. Heart rate increasing slightly. Brain activity shifting. Signs of life, where there had been only absence. Victor pressed his hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Grace sang louder now, her voice gaining strength. The nurses in the hallway paused. The doctors looked up from their charts. Something was happening in room 412, something that didn't fit their training or their protocols. And then, Ethan's eyes shifted. They moved from the ceiling, they tracked sideways, they found Grace's face. And for the first time in weeks, there was someone behind those eyes, someone present, someone home. "Grace," he whispered. His voice was destroyed, barely audible, a breath more than a word. But it was his voice. Victor's knees buckled. He caught himself on the doorframe, unable to contain the sob that tore from his chest. Grace stopped singing and took Ethan's hand in both of hers. "Hello, little one," she said softly. "I came back, just like I promised. I will always come back." Ethan's cracked lips moved. It took him 3 tries to form the words, each syllable a battle against atrophied muscles and remembered silence. "Don't leave again. Never," Grace promised, tears streaming down her face. "Never, never, never. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." She started singing again. And this time, Ethan hummed along. It was weak. It was broken. It was barely more than a thread of sound. But it was the most beautiful music any of them had ever heard. Recovery was not immediate. It was not linear. It was messy and painful and full of setbacks. But it was real. Ethan left the hospital after 3 weeks. Grace moved into the penthouse as his full-time therapeutic companion. Not a maid, not a servant, but a valued member of the family, with appropriate salary, benefits, and respect. Victor fired Mrs. Whitmore within days of Grace's return. The nanny had known about Patricia's schemes, may even have helped facilitate them, and her cold approach to Ethan had been part of the problem all along. The parade of clinical specialists was replaced by a small, carefully chosen team who worked with Grace rather than around her. They respected her expertise. They learned from her approach, and they marveled at the results. Within a month, Ethan was speaking in full sentences again. Within 3 months, he was having conversations. Within 6 months, the boy who had been silent for 4 years was talking so much that Victor joked about wishing for a little quiet. But he never meant it. Every word from his son's mouth was a miracle, a gift, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. And through it all, Grace was there, singing, teaching, seeing, making the invisible visible, making the silent heard. Patricia Wells was prosecuted for fraud, defamation, and evidence tampering. Her trial became a media sensation. The personal assistant, who had manipulated a grieving billionaire, framed an innocent woman, and nearly destroyed a traumatized child. The story had everything: wealth, betrayal, social justice, and ultimately, redemption. Grace testified at the trial. She did so with dignity and composure, recounting her experience without embellishment or drama. She didn't need to exaggerate. The truth was damning enough. The jury delivered a guilty verdict in less than 3 hours. Patricia was sentenced to 7 years in prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, she passed by Grace in the gallery. Their eyes met for a single moment. Patricia's full of venom, Grace's full of something harder to read. "You think you've won?" Patricia hissed. "You're still nothing. You're still just the help." Grace looked at her calmly. "Perhaps. But I know who I am and what I'm worth. Can you say the same?" Patricia had no answer, and as she disappeared through the courtroom doors, Grace felt something lift from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Justice had been served, not perfectly, not completely. There were still scars that would never fully heal, wounds that would ache in bad weather, but it was enough. It was finally enough. 18 months after Grace's return, the Harrington household was unrecognizable. The penthouse, once cold and sterile, had been transformed into a warm, vibrant space full of color and life. Ethan's artwork covered the walls, bright, joyful paintings that pulsed with imagination. Nigerian textiles. Grace had chosen added warmth to the modern furniture. Music played constantly, sometimes classical, sometimes jazz, sometimes the Yoruba songs that had become the family's soundtrack. Ethan, now 9 years old, was thriving. He still attended therapy. He still had difficult days when words came harder and silence seemed safer. He still bore the scars of his trauma, and probably always would. But he was speaking. He was laughing. He was living, and he had made a decision. One evening, he asked Grace and his father to sit down in the living room. He had something important to tell them. "I want to help other kids," he said. "Kids like me. Kids who can't talk. Kids who feel invisible." Victor and Grace exchanged glances. "How would you like to do that, little one?" Grace asked. Ethan took a deep breath. This was a lot of words for him, more than he usually spoke at once, but he had been practicing. "I want to make videos," he said. "About what it's like. About what helped me. About how Grace found my voice. Maybe if other kids see that it's possible, maybe they'll know they're not alone. Maybe they'll know someone sees them too." Victor felt his throat tighten. His son, the boy who had been locked in silence for 4 years, wanted to use his voice to help others find theirs. "I think that's an incredible idea," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We can make that happen." "Really? Really? Whatever you need, cameras, editors, a platform, we'll figure it out together." Ethan's face broke into a radiant smile. Then he turned to Grace. "Will you help me? I need you in the videos, to show people that it takes someone special to see what others can't see." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Of course I will help you, my boy. I would be honored." And that was how the See Me project began. Within a year, See Me had grown beyond anyone's expectations. It started with simple videos, Ethan telling his story, Grace explaining her approach, testimonials from specialists who had learned from her methods. The videos went viral. Millions of views. Hundreds of thousands of shares. Messages pouring in from around the world. Parents of children with selective mutism reaching out for guidance. Adults who had suffered in silence their whole lives finally feeling seen. Teachers, therapists, and caregivers hungry for new approaches that centered compassion over clinical detachment. Victor saw an opportunity and seized it. He established the Grace Mbutu Foundation for Voice Development, a fully funded nonprofit dedicated to research, training, and direct support for families dealing with childhood speech disorders. The foundation hired experts from around the world. It developed training programs based on Grace's methods. It provided scholarships for families who couldn't afford traditional therapy. It funded research into the connections between trauma, silence, and healing. And at the center of it all was Grace, the woman who had cleaned houses for 15 years. The woman whose credentials had been dismissed, whose expertise had been overlooked, whose humanity had been invisible to everyone who should have seen it. Now, she was speaking at conferences, training therapists, advising hospitals. Her face appeared in medical journals and on news programs. Her name was spoken with respect by people who had once looked through her like she was glass. But Grace never forgot where she came from. She still sang Yoruba lullabies. She still wore practical shoes. She still spoke with the melodic accent of her homeland, never trying to hide it or minimize it, because she had learned that the things that made her different were not weaknesses to be overcome. They were gifts to be shared. On the 3rd anniversary of Grace's return, Victor Harrington did something unprecedented. He threw a party, not the kind of party he had thrown before, stiff, formal affairs with catered food and forced conversation, where everyone measured their words and no one had fun. This was a celebration. The penthouse was filled with people. Staff members, foundation employees, families who had been helped by the See Me project, And children, so many children running and laughing and talking, their voices filling the space with joyful chaos. Ethan was the unofficial host, moving through the crowd with confidence that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. He introduced his friends to his father, explained the foundation's work to curious guests, and made sure everyone knew where to find the best snacks. Grace watched him from across the room, her heart full to bursting. Amara appeared at her side. "You know, Mama, I used to be so angry at this country, at how it treated you, at how it made you invisible. And now? Amara smiled. Now I see that you were never actually invisible. You were just surrounded by people who couldn't see. That's their blindness, not your darkness." Grace took her daughter's hand. "When did you become so wise?" "I learned from the best." Across the room, Victor caught Grace's eye. He raised his glass in a silent toast, a gesture of gratitude, of respect, of something deeper that had grown between them over the years. They would never be lovers, that wasn't their story, and they both knew it. But they had become something perhaps more valuable: partners in the work of healing, allies in the fight for visibility, family, in all the ways that mattered. The music changed to something familiar. A Yoruba rhythm, played through the penthouse's high-end speakers. Grace laughed as Ethan appeared before her, holding out his hand. "Dance with me?" he asked. "Like we used to when we were practicing?" "Always, little one, always." She took his hand, and they danced together in the middle of the living room, the billionaire's son and the woman everyone had called just the maid, while the city sparkled beyond the windows and the people who loved them cheered. 5 years later, Ethan Harrington stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia University. He was 14 years old, tall for his age, with his mother's honey-brown eyes and his father's stubborn chin. The conference was about childhood trauma and recovery, and he had been invited to give the keynote address. The irony was not lost on anyone. The room was silent as he stepped to the microphone. Hundreds of faces looked up at him: doctors, researchers, therapists, parents, and patients, all waiting to hear from the boy who had been silent for 4 years. Ethan took a deep breath. "For 4 years of my life," he began, "I couldn't speak. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The words were there, trapped inside me, screaming to get out. But something had broken between my brain and my mouth, and no matter how hard I tried, the path was blocked." He paused, letting the words settle. "During those years, hundreds of people tried to help me. Specialists flew in from around the world. I underwent countless therapies. People talked at me, about me, around me, but almost never to me. I became a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be figured out, a case study to be analyzed." His voice grew stronger, and then a woman came to clean our house. She wasn't a famous doctor. She didn't have degrees from prestigious universities. She was an immigrant who had been overlooked and undervalued her entire time in this country. And she was the one who saved my life. He looked out at the audience, finding Grace's face in the crowd. "Do you know what she did differently?" She saw me. Not as a diagnosis, not as a condition, not as a problem, as a person. She talked to me like I could understand. She sang to me like I could hear. She left me small gifts, like I deserved beauty. She never gave up on me, even when everyone else had. Tears were falling freely now, both his and hers. I'm not standing here today because of medical breakthroughs or innovative therapies. I'm standing here because one woman had the courage to see what everyone else missed. Because she understood that before you can give someone their voice back, you have to show them that their voice matters. He stepped back from the microphone and turned to face Grace directly. "Grace Mbutu gave me my life. She gave me my words. She gave me the belief that I had something worth saying. And I will spend the rest of my days trying to live up to that gift." The auditorium erupted in applause, and in the front row, Grace Mbutu wept tears of joy, the invisible woman who had become the brightest light any of them had ever seen. 10 years later, the Grace Mbutu Foundation had grown into one of the largest childhood development organizations in the world. They had helped over 100,000 children find their voices, They had trained over 25,000 therapists in Grace's methods. They had published research that fundamentally changed how selective mutism and childhood trauma were understood and treated. Grace, now in her 60s, had finally retired from day-to-day operations. She lived in a comfortable house in Westchester, purchased by Victor as a gift she had initially refused, but eventually accepted, surrounded by gardens and quiet, and all the time she wanted to read, to rest, to remember. But she wasn't alone. Ethan visited every Sunday. He was 24 now, finishing medical school, planning to specialize in pediatric psychiatry. He still brought her small gifts, shells from beaches, feathers from parks, paper airplanes he folded while they talked. Some things never changed. Victor came often too, sometimes with his new wife, a kind, unpretentious woman he had met through the foundation, and their young daughter, who called Grace Grandma and demanded lullabies at every visit. The silence that had once defined their lives was gone. In its place was music, laughter, conversation, connection, the things that made life worth living. On Grace's 80th birthday, Ethan gave the toast. "When I was 7 years old," he said, "I couldn't speak. I was trapped inside myself, invisible to everyone around me, convinced that I would be silent forever." He looked at Grace, who sat at the head of the table, surrounded by 3 generations of people who loved her. But Grace saw me. She found me in the darkness and showed me that my voice mattered. She didn't save me because she was paid to, or because she had something to gain, or because anyone recognized her expertise. She saved me because that's who she is, because she refuses to let anyone be invisible. He raised his glass. To Grace Mbutu, the woman who saw what no one else could see, who heard what no one else could hear, who loved a broken child into wholeness, and never asked for anything in return. You taught me that everyone has a voice, even when the world tries to silence them. You taught me that everyone deserves to be seen, even when the world looks away. His voice cracked with emotion. You didn't just give me my words, Grace. You gave me my life. And I will spend every day of it making sure that no one else has to suffer in silence the way I did. He looked around the table at the family that had gathered, biological and chosen, connected by blood and love and shared purpose. To seeing each other, he said, to hearing each other, to never letting anyone be invisible again. To Grace, everyone echoed, raising their glasses. And in the warm light of the candles, surrounded by people who loved her, Grace Mbutu smiled. She had come to America with nothing but dreams. She had been overlooked, undervalued, dismissed. She had been accused of crimes she didn't commit. She had been cast out into the cold. But she had never given up. She had never stopped seeing. She had never stopped believing that every voice matters, especially the ones the world tries to silence. And in the end, the woman nobody noticed had changed everything. For everyone who has ever felt invisible, you are seen. You are heard. You matter. Your voice is a miracle waiting to happen. Never stop believing that someone, somewhere, will be the one who finally sees